Hey guys, as some of you already know, there's an organisation, I think from Switzerland, that tests 113 countries where English is spoken as a second language. So I think it's every year they do it. They give tests to thousands of people in each of those 113 countries, English tests, and then compare the English proficiency levels of the people in each of those countries, right? And the first time we mentioned this in a video was probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I remember talking about this when Japan was ranked 30th. It was about 30th out of 113 countries, right? And that was about 10 or 12 years ago. And then I remember mentioning it again in another video a few years ago, and at that stage they got to 67th or something, 67th, something like that. And then more recently, maybe a year or two ago, sorry about that, guys. Sorry about that. Maybe a year or two ago, I mentioned it in another video, and at that stage, Japan was 80th out of 113 countries, right? Anyway, the statistics have just come out again, and this time Japan's ranked 87th out of 113 countries where English is spoken as a second language. Just to put it in perspective, number 86 is Afghanistan. So in other words, if you went to Afghanistan and had a chat to the locals, you'd have a better chance of having a competent conversation in English with someone in Afghanistan than you would in Japan. So as long as we've been sort of keeping an eye out, whenever those statistics come up, we always have a look. And as long as we've been doing that, it's never once improved. Every year, end over end, it's dropped. The proficiency's dropped. So it's sort of not surprising. Oh look, just before I forget too, whenever I talk about this topic, there's always someone who gets all emotional and says, you know, in Japan the language is Japanese, they don't have to speak English. And for the 100th time, I'll just say, we've never once said in any video that Japanese people should speak English. Never once said it. The language in Japan is Japanese, right? We never say Japanese people should speak English. The Japanese government has repeatedly said over the years that they want to improve the level of English in Japan. They've said it, but we've never said it. So, because we don't care, right? We've got our English-friendly directory, which is just basically a listing of businesses and companies and organisations in Japan that are English-friendly, right, where they do have a reasonably competent amount of English happening. And that website wouldn't exist if we're in a country like Denmark or Finland or one of the other countries in the top 10 where English is really common. They don't need websites like an English-friendly directory, because the standards of English in those countries are so high that anybody who wants to speak English can pretty well do it anywhere, pretty much. The only reason that website's of use to people in Japan is that if you're an English-speaking person who comes to Japan and you can't speak Japanese, that sort of has some benefit to you. So just reiterating, we're not saying Japanese people should speak English. We don't care if they do or not. The Japanese government does, and what often happens is when these statistics come out and Japan's fallen again, quite often what will happen is somebody will ask, or a reporter will ask some politician, what do you think about this? And they'll, oh yes, we need to do something about it. And over the years we've reported different things that they've said that they do to try and improve the English. Remember, some of you guys might remember about 2015 when Japan won the Olympic bid for the 2020 Olympics. They made a big statement at the time about how before the 2020 Olympics, Japan was going to increase its English competency so that, you know, we could welcome the world when the world comes. And I actually mentioned that in a video at the time and had a good chuckle about that, because I knew those sorts of hollow statements don't do anything. And that's what they frequently do. They make these hollow statements about how they're going to improve things, but they don't change anything. You know, another one they did a few years ago was they said that you know, we're going to make a policy that from now on, anybody who's going to teach English in Japan has to go and spend at least 1 month in an English-speaking country, thinking that if they send all the Japanese people that teach English to another country for a month, that will magically increase their English ability, and that'll help everybody's English, which obviously that never happened either. They had another one recently where they were talking about something similar to that. They're going to do something similar, but it just, the problem is they don't care, right? They don't care. From the people that we have in our life, they don't care, and it actually feels like they care less. I remember 20 years ago, if I was at a festival or even riding on the train, quite often people would come sit next to me to speak English. And sometimes it'd be high school kids, or sometimes it would be adults, and they'd just come up to me at a festival, hello, how are you, and they'd want to speak English to me. Or on a train, I remember people sitting next to me on the train specifically, they'd sort of, you could see that they were making an effort to get to where I was to sit next to me so that they could make a conversation and have some English practice for 30 minutes or so, and I can't remember the last time that happened. And just from the people around us, our friends and family and neighbours and so on, they're just not interested. They're just not. I mentioned my GP recently, my doctor. He can speak English quite well, and he actually spent a few years going to university in the US. And as a result of that, he's got access to all the information from around the world with whatever's happening, which is really reassuring from a doctor. But for most people in Japan, they get all their information through the filter of another Japanese person. And we see this all the time on television. There'll be some story about something that's happening in another country, some world event or some technology or something new that's happening. And I'll sit around the studio talking about it, and some sensei, some Japanese guy, will be there explaining it all to them. And particularly social stuff and things like that. Quite often, it's the way they're describing it is like from 50 years ago, and so some people like this fact is because it keeps Japan isolated, and this is one of the reasons that Japanese society has changed so little and continues to change, so little, is because the outside influence is minimal, because almost everybody gets their influence from other Japanese people. A lot of us that live in other countries we get our influence from all over the place, don't we? We can watch movies and television, TV shows and documentaries and stuff on YouTube and the internet and everything else, and we can get loads of information about any topic from all over the place, can't we? COVID was a good example of that. When COVID was happening, we were getting our information from all over the place. And you can sort of dig through it, can't you, and decide what stuff you think's credible and what isn't. Whereas Japanese people can't do that. If they search a topic in Japanese, they get really limited responses. And it's all from Japanese people. It's all written in Japanese for Japanese people. So they see life through filters, and with all sorts of medical things. I mean, some of their thinking about some medical stuff, the contraceptive pill, we made a video about that years ago. They're thinking about the contraceptive pill, including a lot of Japanese doctors, was really back 50 years ago when the pill had all sorts of side effects and they hadn't sort of nailed it down and hadn't sort of sorted it out. And the general consensus in Japan is that the contraceptive pill's a bad thing, including the thinking of a lot of the doctors. And it's because all the information that they've got on it has come from within. They've just got this pond of information, and the only bits that get added to it are from other Japanese people and through their eyes, right, through their perspectives. And because a lot of it's twisted as a result. Things that we watch on TV, often they'll be talking about something that I know a bit about from the internet, from the US or from the UK or from Europe or something. But the Japanese perspective on it, when you hear some sensei on TV here explaining it to everybody, and it's like, what's he talking about? Or some psychology thing or some medical thing or something. It's like, what? And they're all sitting there listening to him and his perspective on it, all going, oh, very interesting. Whereas in a lot of other countries, there'd be some of those people sitting there around him would say, I read this, and challenge what he said, But here, that's not how it works. They get their information through these filters, through these different sensei and different important people, and they just believe whatever they're told, and that's their whole source of information. So, you know, they're just not interested. They're just not interested in English. They're really not. They're just the people we know. It's the same thing. They're just not into it. And if they are interested in it, it's sort of in a casual, sort of like a hobby sort of way. Let's do some English. You know, I mean, we told you about what it's like. We went up to see our kids' lesson once, and actually one time we went to see our kids' lesson at the elementary school, and they had an English lesson that particular day, which was just abysmal. You know, 11 and 12-year-olds. Can you ride a unicycle? And then we had this thing recently where we went up to see her class again, and the next class had an English lesson going on, and it was equally bad. And we talked about the TV English lessons as well, which is like 80% some old Japanese dude speaking Japanese, explaining stuff about English, explaining English grammar or explaining something in Japanese, and all you hear is blah 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 in Japanese, and then occasionally on comes the dancing clown, you know, the foreign guy, to come on and go, can you ride a unicycle? And that's it. It's just terrible. It's just terrible, and it's because they're not really, the goal isn't, okay, let's get really good at communicating in English. That's not the goal. It's more like, let's do a little bit of English. You know, a little bit of light entertainment. And the people in our lives, we had a family at our house this afternoon, and because we hear this, you know, oh, he's having English lessons at the moment. Oh, is he? And then this kid, it was only a few months ago, the mother told us that he was having English lessons, and I said, oh, that's good, do you like English? And he said, oh, etto nandake, which, you know, it means he didn't really understand the question, do you like English? And then today they were at our house, and I said something about the English lesson, and she said, oh no, he stopped because of baseball. And we've got, actually just reminded me, my English buddy, there's a buddy I've got here who's from England, and he has kids' English lessons, right? He's got an English school, and he has kids' English lessons, and he goes off. He absolutely goes off, and I was actually mentioning him before because the parents of his students prioritize everything else before English, right? Everything else gets prioritized before English. So baseball class, or, you know, I actually mentioned briefly once that one of his students had the opportunity to go to Canada for a homestay thing for a couple of weeks. And it was all exciting, and the parents said to him, what do you think? And he said, oh, it's a great idea, do that, you know, it's a really good idea. That's what the English guy said to the parents, you know, do that, it's a great idea, what a great opportunity. That'll really help his English, you know. And they went to school and asked the teacher, and the teacher said yes, and they had to go and ask the baseball coach at the school, and keep in mind, elementary school kids, right? And they had to go ask the baseball coach if it was okay, and the baseball coach said no. No, you can't miss lessons. No, you can't miss practice, baseball practice, no. And so the parents went, oh, okay. Right? So our English buddy lost his mind because, you know, he gets that all the time. And this is the bottom line. This is the bottom line. They don't think it's important. And usually all these people that we know, they can't speak English. You know, my extended Japanese family here, there's nobody in there that can have a conversation with me in English. Our neighbours, there's not one neighbour that can have a conversation in English. There's, you know, there's really no one here. There's no one here that I know that I can sit down and have a conversation with in English. You know, their level's just not good enough. And they don't care, right? And the result of that is it's generational. So the grandparents couldn't speak English, and it didn't matter. And then the kids' parents can't speak English, and it doesn't matter. I can't speak English. You imagine, I mean, there'd be some people in Australia that would say the same thing. You know, I can't speak French. You know, I've never needed to speak French, so it doesn't matter. And there's a lot of Japanese parents that are the same. Their thinking is that they've never been able to speak English, they've never used it. Right? So unless you work for one of the big international companies in Japan where they've made the language English, for example, Mitsubishi, Toyota, Rakuten, JAL, Japan Airlines. So some of the big companies like that have said that staff have to have a TE score, TOEIC score, test of English for international communications. They have to have a TOEIC score of about 650, which is reasonably high. So unless you work for one of those companies in Japan, you won't need English. And then if you travel, you can actually book a tour of pretty well any country in the world with JTB, the Japanese tour company, and they'll fly you there by JAL. You can talk Japanese on the airplane. You arrive there, the Japanese tour guide will be waiting there with a flag and give you a tour. Our in-laws did it. Our in-laws wanted to go to Australia. I didn't have the money or the time. So my in-laws went for a tour in Australia with a Japanese tour company, and my in-laws can't speak a word of English. So they just booked it with JTB, flew to Australia on JAL, arrived in Australia, got picked up by the tour guide, had a tour of Australia for a week or two, and then flew home. Didn't use English at all. So they don't need English, right? That's their thinking. So they're happy. They're happy that they figure they don't need English at work. They don't need English to travel. Getting information in other languages from around the world, that doesn't matter. They're happy to get their information from sensei, whoever sensei happens to be, right? So, they're happy with that. They're not interested. And I can see that continuing and then continuing to go down that list because that generational thing. The grandparents didn't need English, the parents don't think they need English. They treat, I mentioned before in a video that they treat their club, their sports, their baseball or soccer or whatever they're playing, they treat it like they're getting ready for the Olympics, and they'll train that 6, 7, 8 hours a week or more, 10, 12, 14 hours a week, like they're training for the Olympics, And then my buddy's English class, 1 hour a week of English class, they'll cancel that because they don't have time anymore because they're too busy with baseball or badminton or whatever else they're busy with, And they just, that's all normal for them. They all think that's normal to stop 1 hour of English a week. That's his English class, right? Is 1 hour a week. I think it's 50 minutes actually. But they'll quit his 50-minute a week English class so they can spend more time spending 14 hours a week at soccer or badminton or one of those. And nobody sees that as odd or silly or anything. No, that's fine. So it doesn't surprise me one little bit. Those of you who live in Japan, doesn't surprise any of us one little bit, does it? Most Japanese people, there's exceptions to this of course, like my doctor and other various people where they do think English is important and they try and improve their levels, but the majority of Japanese people just don't care. And probably rightfully so. Probably the majority of them will never need English. They're just quite happy just to live here and do their thing here and take a Japanese tour if they want to go somewhere and, get all their information from watching NHK. It's just terrible. It explains why Japanese people have some weird ideas about different things, because all their influence is coming from the same small pond. There's nothing new coming in from the outside to give them different perspectives for most of them, So, just the way it is. So, yeah, not surprised at all. So, next time I'll make a video about this. So, what are they? 87 out of 113 at the moment. So, I'm guessing next time I make this video, there'll be about 95 out of 113, because I'm guessing it's going to continue to fall until they get to 113. Probably. Wouldn't surprise me one little bit. So, and again, I don't care. I'm not making this video because I care whether anybody can speak English here or not. I'm making this video because it's anything and everything about Japan, and this is what's in the news this week. Not big in the news either, by the way. Not big in the news. They're not really interested. I actually read that in an English language Japanese newspaper. So, because probably in the Japanese version they didn't even mention it because nobody cares. They just don't. If anything, it would bother them a bit to hear that their rankings dropped, and they don't want to hear it. So it probably won't get talked about in the mainstream Japanese media. They won't want to talk about it. It's too negative, Don't want to hear about that. Anyway, sorry about that. Okay, very good. That's the end of that for now. We'll discuss that again later. More videos coming soon.